Josh Swanson, Vogel Law Firm.
All right, thanks for joining the program today. We got kind of a 2-for-1 interview here today because Mr. Swanson, not only at Vogel Law Firm, but he does the Bison Podcast, and I can't, is that the name of it? What's the name of the podcast? I apologize.
The Bison Illustrated Podcast, and then the terrestrial radio version, Heard It Here with Swanee on 740 AM, The Fan. And I should add, the award-winning Heard It Here with Swanee, we found out a couple of weeks ago the program actually won a Severide Award. So a neat thing for the program in its first year to be recognized like that. And we certainly appreciate all the folks out there listening to both the podcast and the radio show.
Wow. So this is like legendary for me because, I've also won a Severide and a Severide Award and a Marconi Award as well. Through the same radio affiliates that you were on, that your program's on. And congratulations, by the way. That's outstanding. I mean, this is did you realize that you're kind of doing that multimedia thing where you're really stretching your podcast into radio programs and extending the reach and the distribution? I mean, that's fantastic. And also a magazine too, right?
Yeah, and that's one of the things. I know you and I have talked about it several times before with different platforms and content and where media is going in the 21st century here. But, a couple of years ago with the podcast, a lot like you did, that's what I was thinking, having listened to a lot of podcasts, invested in the equipment myself, and I'm, an old radio guy. The year between college and law school, I actually worked for KFGO and learned how to use the boards and the audio equipment, so I edit my own podcast, and it really grew from there, having written a column for Bison Illustrated for the, I think 11 years, 12 years that there has been a Bison Illustrated magazine, writing since day one, but then taking that next step into the podcast, which led into the weekly radio show on The Fan, which has turned into just a bunch of appearances on the KFGO family of networks, and I've really enjoyed it, and I'll tell you, the listeners out there hearing our voices right now, it's some pretty high-octane powered radio with a couple Severide Award winners, and I don't have a Marconi yet or anything, but yeah, it's just knowing the background of Eric Severide, Velva, North Dakota guy, one of Edwin R. Murrow's boys covering World War II, is a history major. It was extra special for me, and especially loving North Dakota, being born and raised here, to win one of those certainly wasn't expected, and the station put the show up for it. But yeah, I share that same passion as you do, Jason, with different media platforms, whether it's podcasting, the radio, or the Bison Illustrated magazine that we do, which is now fully digital too, so listeners can go to the issue website, that's ISSUU, and the fully digital downloadable version of the Illustrated is free up there as well.
I think this is, by the way, I just realized how great of a guest you are for my entire radio listening audience, which is about a 5-state area. I've got affiliates in eastern Wyoming, eastern Montana, North Dakota, and then, of course, that bleeds into Minnesota, and then as well as South Dakota down in the Black Hills. And Jack Michaels, of course, 740 The Fan. He's probably won many national and state awards as well. He's going to go into the Hall of Fame without a doubt if he's not already there. I would text him from different parts across the upper Midwest. I'd be like booming in Belle Fourche, and because I would pick up 740 The Fan all the way out in the Black Hills, all the way out in eastern Montana. So to our listening audience out there, what time is your program on 740 The Fan? Because sometimes, like I say, in the car and everything out in the Black Hills and in the Badlands, I can pick up 740 The Fan way across the state, because you guys are out of Fargo, right? That's where the signal's out of, is Fargo?
Yeah, that's what Jack likes to say. Jack is a Williston guy, an old Williston coyote, and the triple towers of power out of Fargo on 25th Street, and Heard It Here runs. We're working on some things that we hope to announce here in the next month or so, but right now Heard It Here runs in the fall for football season from 8 to 9 in the mornings on 740 AM The Fan. But the podcast, we do the weekly podcast, which is on iTunes, Spotify, Google Play, and SoundCloud, and listeners can also check that out at Bison Illustrated.com, and it's the stretch. And again, you and I, Jason, have talked about this: the power of digital media and podcasting. Where I'll have attorneys who have been practicing in Vogel, a few of them who just got their 40-year practice recognitions from the State Bar Association within the last few years. They listen to podcasts, and they'll ask me what podcasts I'm listening to. And when I'm traveling out in western North Dakota, in fact, the last time, and I'm not just doing the promotion for your program, because obviously we're a sponsor and part of that, but just to let listeners know how this pays off. I had a call already from a gentleman in western North Dakota dealing with the Lake Minerals case that we visited about last time, looking for representation, and he got my name because he heard me on one of the posts that you had put up on social media with our last interview. So I certainly appreciate that, and that's, that it's one of those things. You and I talking on the phone right now, the reach and the number of people it's getting out to has already led to clients for me. So I can speak to that, and we certainly appreciate what the Crude Life Network's doing.
Well, thank you very much. We were talking a little bit off the air about how I've been kind of lying in the weeds the last 3 years, just kind of, raising my son and dealing with some health issues and a few other things. But sometimes when you lie in the weeds, you build your foundation a little bit better than you think. And when I look back at what I've done, and I'm bringing this up because you understand this, and so I'm going to kind of disclose a little bit of our secret sauce here at the Crude Life. I'm glad to hear about that social media, because I immediately thought radio, because we're on, honestly, about 30 radio stations. And so this interview is going to appear on about 30 radio stations, and it appears all the time because they don't air it at the same time. It airs at different times during different days and different cities. You know what I mean? And so it's just this constant activity that we have going on. Well, and then we have the podcast too. So that's another way that people can get that activity. And so it's good to hear about the social media too, because our social media is like 350,000 when you put our network together. We've got 50,000 in the Bakken, another 100,000 down in Texas, some 80,000 out in the Marcellus, and all these different shale plays, and you put them together, and Twitter and YouTubes and all these different things. So we call that our ecosystem of activity. So it's an ecosystem of energy activity. And that's interesting to know that it was a social media post, and that alerted them to the audio interview or whatever we have going on here. So great. And that's exactly what you've built instinctively. That's what I'm getting at, is that essentially you're taking the same content, but you're putting it through magazine and a podcast and a radio show. Am I correct on that?
I think the perfect word you used, Jason, was ecosystem, because I think there's a train of thinking that between the old school traditional radio, which both you and I love and have a passion for, along with the podcast, it doesn't have to be an either or. So I know for me, a lot of times when I'm working during the day or doing phone calls or interviews, I like to catch up on the news that would be on the normal radio stations by listening to the podcast when I'm driving into work or driving home from work, or even driving to and fro for meetings during the day. So I think that's the perfect word, as an ecosystem, and that's, it's mutually reinforcing, and that's what we've looked to do with the different channels of content we've created, whether it's the radio show, the podcast, and then the magazine and the website. We have that BisonIllustrated.com. So the more different channels of content and distribution platforms that somebody can have, that's what appeals to me, and where I think we're on the same page, how valuable it is to get the message out there. Because whether it's someone like my grandpa or my dad maybe driving the pickup in central North Dakota between fields, or driving out in Alexander or Tioga or Ray in western North Dakota, or someone my age or even younger, the kids at, let's say, NDSU or Bismarck State's Energy Center of Excellence right now, who might be learned to podcasting when they're, I know for me, when I'm running at the YMCA, getting my miles in every day, I've got a podcast on and I'm catching up. And I think there are so many advantageous platforms for whether it's you or me to reach listeners and tell the story, especially in the oil and gas industry, and the work you're doing and the work we're doing at Vogel Law Firm, where it really is cutting-edge stuff. It really is cutting-edge stuff, and the time to get in on it is right now.
I think so too. By the way, Josh Swanson, Vogel Law Firm, on the line with us. I know you're probably thinking, okay, why is an attorney talking about media? Well, he's got a background in it. And, what years did you work at KFGO, did you say?
I was at KFGO right after I graduated from NDSU in the spring of '05. I spent a year working for the big redhead himself. So Eddie Schultz.
Oh, no
Big
kidding.
Eddie took me in. Yeah, Big Ed took me in, and I learned how to do a soundboard. Folks will remember Tank McNamara. He had left for another opportunity, and Ed was looking for a new guy, and it just so happened I planned to take a year off between college and law school, and was kind of working somewhere where it was kind of just a temp thing for a year, and Ed heard about that. So I worked for him for about, I think, 14 to 18 months, but then as I was going through law school, I'd come back, and he'd have me doing random projects and working on different things for him, and I'd fly back to Fargo and fill in during law school breaks on his show, running the boards and helping to produce the show and come up with content. So I really got a firsthand, doctorate level education in radio from Ed, seeing how he did it every day. And I think there's different things I learned from him. And obviously there's never, whether folks loved him or hate him, Ed was, really, really good at radio.
Oh, he was fantastic.
I don't know that I don't know that there will ever be another Ed Schultz, but I just learned a lot of things for that 14 or 18 months every day sitting next to him in the studio and how he did things. So that's kind of how I grew up in the radio business, and then just stayed passionate about it. And especially for someone like me, the real interesting thing is as many miles as I put on driving to western North Dakota or flying all over the country for oil and gas related things, I'm listening to podcasts and I'm listening to the radio all the time. So just different things that a guy picks up on. And you really, what Ed used to always say, he obviously had the TV show, but his comment was it gets in your blood. And once radio and talk is in your blood, it's something that, even though I'm a lawyer now, it's something I'm still really passionate about, and it's more than, just a hobby, obviously, starting a podcast and a radio show and putting the time into it, but it's just such a great platform for telling stories.
I'm going to put it out there right now. If there's anyone listening who would sponsor a Ed Schultz story, either a documentary or a movie, I would gladly spearhead that. Could you imagine his life story on the big screen? That would be amazing. I mean, that man would make a boring football game seem like it was the Super Bowl, just on the radio. His tone and his language and just his grasp of the game made it exciting. Made 4-4 teams exciting to listen to on the radio. Do you remember that?
I do, and I've got to share a story. One of my favorite Big Eddie stories. I'll share with the listeners. Here's the flavor for what a documentary could be, and there's probably hundreds of stories like this. I was out in Denver with Ed for a conference back in 2008. I had a break during law school, and I was out doing different things during the day, and Ed and the couple other folks on his team were doing a few things, and the plan was to meet at John Elway's Steakhouse in Denver one night. So I get done with the meeting I'm at, and I go to John Elway's Steakhouse, and Ed and his wife Wendy and another guy on his team are sitting there at a table, and I sit down, and they've all got these cat-like grins on their faces, and I'm thinking, what are they grinning about? What is so darn funny going on? And Ed gives a head nod to a table next to us, and sitting literally at the table next to us is Charles Barkley. So we're not going to say anything to him, interrupt his dinner, but he interrupts our dinner. So after about 5 minutes of sitting down, Charles Barkley walks up to the table and says, "Big Eddie, my brother Big Eddie, Ed Schultz." And we're thinking, how does Charles Barkley know who Ed Schultz is? And this is before Ed had his MSNBC show. "Big Eddie, I see you all the time on CNN, man." And it went on like that for 10 minutes where Barkley is just talking to us. And in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, are you kidding me? This is the round mound of rebound Charles Barkley just shooting the breeze with us. And Charles buys us a drink and then, says his farewell. The next day, we're at this big, this grill and sports bar in downtown Denver for some radio thing. And Barkley walks in, and a lot of people in TV and radio are in this same restaurant. People from CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, and you've got advisors for a bunch of different political campaigns in there. And Charles Barkley walks in, and even for them, the record stops. They're thinking, "Holy cow, that's Charles Barkley!" And we're sitting kind of in a corner off to ourselves. And the first thing Charles Barkley says, "GD, man, Ed Schultz, I can't get away from you anywhere, brother." And everyone in that restaurant, John King, Dana Bash, Mark Penn, who was running, I think, Clinton's campaign at the time, they all whipped their heads around to stare at Ed, thinking, how in the hell does Ed Schultz know Charles Barkley? And then Barkley comes up to our table again, and it gave us a bunch of street cred, because Charles Barkley, the first thing he does when he walks in is beeline it for Ed Schultz, and that's just many stories. But yeah, I could talk all day about that, but yeah, that would be a fantastic documentary.
Wouldn't it be? I mean, Ed Schultz, of course, I was going to mention, we should probably say it's hard to say what he's noted for, because most people might know him from MSNBC, but he also was on, was it Russian TV or Real TV or whatever it was at the end, RT TV, and then he was on, he did a lot of political stuff. And one of the things that we were talking about the other day with Derek Hansen, who's program director now at KFGO, one of our former alumni of radio, he of course, he knew Ed Schultz very well, Derek Hansen, Mr. Blonde, and he mentioned to me that Nightside, do you remember the show Nightside that Ed used to do? It got like a 30 share, or something like that. It just got huge numbers, and it was just Ed. Whatever Ed did got ratings. And he had so many different veins, from sports to politics to his personal life to his hunting and fishing to, didn't he own a cabin up in Ontario? 10, 15 years ago he bought one too. So, he had a lot of really interesting veins of life, but he excelled in like a lot of areas. That's what I mean. He's a really good story. He'd be a really good movie.
I think that's, Ed doesn't get enough credit for that. He was very, very business savvy and very sharp, and he had his hand in a lot of things. That TV show he more or less made happen, along with, James Holmes, another old KFGO guy who's at MSNBC working for one of the shows there as an executive producer. Ed didn't have anything handed to him. He went out and worked for it, and he had not just a fishing, cabin. He had his own resort that he bought and turned into a business. He had a construction company going on for a while. He had his radio show, which, toward the end of his national syndication days, it was up to, I think, like 120 or 130 stations across the country that he was an owner of. He had Rush Limbaugh's, I think, former producer or one of the VPs at Clear Channel who was working for Rush came over and was involved as a business partner in helping Ed start his national radio show, which he ultimately grew. How many people have enough savvy in the cutthroat world of network television, cable news? Ed was able to parlay a national show into his own TV show, and the number of things he had his hand in, and just the stories that he would tell and what he had saw, and the news and views on KFGO, and then the bringing the high school sports to the upper Midwest on TV, and of course his days calling. One of the most interesting conversations I've ever had with Ed, he flew me out to 30 Rock because I hadn't been out there yet, and he was doing his national TV show, and he calls me one day and says, "Swan, we haven't had you out to 30 Rock. Why don't you come by this week, meet me at the airport in Detroit Lakes." He had a private jet. So I meet him there, and we spend the better part of the flight into Teterboro talking about the North Dakota State days and his experiences calling games for the Bison, and then the fallout when he left the Bison to go to UND and what happened there. And a lot of people don't know he paid attention all the way up until he was doing his national TV show. We were talking about those first few, I think it was about 2012 when I was out there. We were talking about the 2011 national championship team and the days when Don Morton and Rocky Hager and Earl Solomonson used to coach the Bison football team. We're talking about this as we're flying into Exeter. We're flying into New Hampshire. Ed's got a private interview with Joe Biden when Biden was the VP at that Phillips Exeter Academy or whatever it is up there. So they just have a big town hall, and when it's done, it's Ed and Biden one-on-one sitting there on the stage doing an interview for MSNBC, and I'm the guy glued to the wall thinking, are you frickin' kidding me? And on the flights there and back, we were talking about North Dakota State football and the local days, and that's something that, you know, he kept an eye on for many, many years after leaving the local market.
You know, and for those people listening who want to maybe sponsor or, you know, have kick a few bucks to Swanee, you want to work on the project because it sounds like you'd be pretty good at it. We would definitely use the lens that Ed Schultz, at least from my perspective, Ed Schultz was probably one of the most passionate people I've ever met. And when you say, you know, love him or hate him, I see him as just being a passionate person, and the reaction of whether you love or hate him comes from that passion. Does that make sense to you?
It does, and you know, Ed was always good to me. I mean, I saw both sides of the coin. I was sitting in the control room next to James Holm at MSNBC, where Ed got a little mad. Let's just put it that way. The guy
Ed never got a little mad.
and not only did he get mad, so the guy running the teleprompter was like his first day, and a teleprompter thing looks like one of those balls on a Golden Tee machine. And the guy goofed it up, and Ed was such a perfectionist. If you didn't know any better, no one watching on TV would have known that Ed slipped up, but Ed knew, and he had that high of a demand on him and his team where he lost it on the teleprompter guy, and someone in the control room had tipped off NBC Global's management. So when we got, Ed had his own big office space and suite in 30 Rock, and when we got back to the studio, there's Phil Griffin, who is the head of the NBC News division, waiting to let Ed have it for Ed losing his cool. And it comes from that passion and just the expectations he put on himself. And like I said, he was always good to me, but I know what you're talking about, because he was fiercely driven. He was a competitor, and he had a little bit of that fiery side too that could come out from time to time. And I think that's a big part of the reason why he moved the needle, and he knew how to move the needle, and it was just such a wonderful experience, kind of cutting my teeth my first job out of college, working for him, and you know, the legacy he left behind, especially here in North Dakota, and you know, nationally folks can say what they will about it, but those of us who are familiar with radio and media in the state of North Dakota and the Red River Valley, certainly there's no one like him at all that's done it up here.
So we should transition into talking a little bit about a few of the NFL players that got drafted. That was one of the reasons why we wanted Mr. Swanson to come on. I'm looking at the time here, and this turned into an impromptu tribute to Ed Schultz, which actually I'm enjoying this because I love the idea of actually doing a documentary or movie on it, because I think he's actually it would have so much national appeal that it would surprise people. I don't think people nationally would really understand how much passion he had, and over the body of his work in life, it was a lot more good than bad. It was much more good than bad. And I know what you mean. I saw the good and the bad, you know, but at the same time, I saw how it was all fueled by passion. It just was. And, you know, that competitiveness. But, okay, let's get to Ed Schultz. Of course, he's called NDSU football. You do an NDSU podcast. You also, by the way, Vogel Law Firm, Josh Swanson, he practices law, a lot of minerals up in the Bakken right now. So if anybody's looking for a mineral attorney and wants to talk a little football, I guess this would be your guy. So talk to me a little bit about Easton Stick. I saw he got drafted. Is he the only Bison? No, three of them did. Three, right?
Well, Easton was the only Bison drafted. He was taken in the 5th round by the LA Chargers, but there were 6 other Bison, that signed undrafted free agent deals or have an invite to one of the rookie mini camps. So, you know, Robbie Grimsley, safety, is with the Saints. Darius Shepard, receiver, went to Green Bay. Bruce Anderson, stud running back with Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Jalen Allison, a 4-year staple at defensive back, ended up with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Tanner Volson, 9-man football, Jason, 9-man football, pride of Belfour, North Dakota, playing for Dre Ganamuse. He's got a deal with the Los Angeles Chargers. Then Lance Dunn has an invite to the LA Rams rookie tryout and training camp to have 7 guys with some sort of professional deals. What Easton did is incredible. There's very few programs that have their last 2 starting quarterbacks drafted, but to have 6 guys in NFL camps is just a testament to what Coach Kleiman was doing there, obviously, and now what Matt Entz looks to continue as the new head coach.
I heard that Philadelphia had the next pick and they drafted a quarterback. I also heard there was very good speculation that Philadelphia wanted Easton Stick, who of course backed up Carson Wentz in college. Did you hear that similar things, or did you hear anything else?
If Easton would have been on the board, if the Chargers went to taking him with that pick, I would say it was a safe bet that the Eagles would have grabbed him. The Eagles ended up with the pick after Carson was taken, and they took the quarterback out of Northwestern in the Big Ten. Carson and Easton are best buddies. Easton was in Carson's wedding. Easton backed him up. He's a mentor. They text back and forth. And so when you talk about having a guy in the quarterback room in Philadelphia that understands Carson, has a good relationship, and can learn a lot in his own right, being the number 2 or 3 quarterback in the Eagles quarterback room, that would have been a neat thing for both Carson and Easton, I think, and for Bison fans. But the opportunity Easton has now in Los Angeles for the Chargers, backing up Phillip Rivers, who will be an NFL Hall of Fame quarterback, who's now at the tail end of his career, to carry a clipboard for a couple of years here, then have an opportunity after Phillip Rivers retires in 2, 3, 4 years, whatever it is. Easton is walking into a really, really good situation with the Chargers.
I was going to ask you, it seemed like he's in one of the better situations, learning from who many consider one of the greater quarterbacks of this generation. The only thing missing is a Super Bowl ring. I agree with you. He'll be a Hall of Fame quarterback. Probably has 2-3 years left before either he retires or the Chargers move him to a new team. And is that kind of how it's looking here? Or is there anybody else that's, competing right now for him? Or do they look at Easton Stick as, you know what, he could be the next starter, or at least the next, good backup type of a thing?
I think that's exactly how the Chargers are looking at him. And I'll tell folks something about Easton Stick. He's a competitor. Easton's not going to be content to carry a clipboard for his entire NFL career. And there's talk from draft analysts and experts that he's a guy that could be a long-term backup quarterback in the NFL. And folks that are saying that are going to have some crow to eat in a couple of years, because Easton Stick is a fierce competitor. He's a hard worker, and he's going to the NFL to be a starting quarterback. So within the next few years, I think North Dakota State is going to have 2 starting quarterbacks in the NFL. Easton Stick is a good quarterback in his own right. You have to be. I mean, if you think about it, Jason, Easton Stick is the all-time winningest quarterback in FCS history, and the 2 quarterbacks to play before him were Carson Wentz, who was the number 2 overall pick in the draft, and before him, Brock Jensen, who won 3 national championships and was the previous all-time winningest quarterback in NFL history. So Easton had some huge shoes to follow at North Dakota State, and not only did he do that, he established himself in his own right. He understands, one of the things that the Chargers head coach was talking about yesterday was how impressed they were. They sent Easton a packet, a mini playbook to get him familiar with it, and then they brought him in a few days after that to their facility in LA and had him diagram some plays. And what the Chargers head coach said was they were blown away by his understanding of the concepts of what the Chargers are trying to do offensively, and how he was able to diagram the plays they sent him and explain those on a whiteboard, just the gray matter and mental acuity for him to do that. That's something that you can be 6'4" and have the biggest arm in the world as a potential NFL quarterback, but if you don't understand the mental side of it and how many decisions you have to make and process in a span of 4 seconds from your pre-snap reads to getting the snap to delivering the ball, the firepower and horsepower you got to have inside your head to do that. Easton Stick might be the best quarterback drafted as far as that sort of understanding and sophistication goes, and I think that's why he's going to be a stud NFL quarterback.
Well, that was one of the national reports I heard about him, and that was the reason why the Eagles were interested in him, was not because he was Carson Wentz's good friend, but that was a reason. Not because he was the most winning quarterback in FCS history, but that was a reason. But the main reason was because of his locker room presence, that he was a man of character, and he had an intelligent head on his shoulders, and they would rather have guys like that that seem to be more solid and steady than, say, a blue chip risk or, a project or something like that when you get into those later rounds. So to me, that makes total sense. And I could see where the Chargers are going to really like him if he's a hardworking guy, I would think.
And I'll tell you what, he's not going to get up in the flash and the sizzle of being an NFL quarterback, getting a bunch of money. The guy is going to be just like Carson, the first one to show up in the morning at the Chargers facility and the last one to leave at night. He's going to be the guy on the phone with the other quarterbacks and other offensive players at 11 o'clock at night or watching film at 2 in the morning. His work ethic is that intense, and on top of it, he is so well respected by his teammates. Get this. He was voted a 3-year captain. So from his sophomore year forward, his teammates, and that's rare at any level of football where you're voting for a guy to be your team captain as a sophomore. His teammates hold him in such high regard where, he gets all these accolades, all this recognition, but he never let it go to his head, and his teammates just respected the heck out of him for it. And if you talk to, listeners in western North Dakota will know the name Randy Hedberg from Newtown, North Dakota, NDSU's quarterback coach. Sit down and listen to what Coach Hedberg or Coach Kleiman or Coach Entz has to say about Easton Stick, and just to hear the way a guy like Coach Hedberg, who was drafted by the Tampa Bay Buccaneers in the 70s, had a Hall of Fame career at Minot State, just what he has to say about Easton, I think, speaks volumes to what Easton Stick will bring to the LA Chargers. Josh
Swanson, Vogel Law Firm, represents quite a bit of mineral rights in the oil and gas community, but also he has a podcast for his favorite NDSU football team, North Dakota State football team. Of course, they've won seven championships in the last 8 years, was it?
7, yeah, that's correct. 7 national titles in the last 8 years going back to 2011. And the 1 year they didn't win the championship, they lost in a tight game in the national semifinals. So they've been in the Final Four.
Eastern Washington, controversial play.
Back in 2010, that one was a tight one too. If it had it not been for Eastern Washington back in 2010, and then James Madison in 2016,
James Madison.
North Dakota State could have 9 straight.
That's right. Okay. Well, anyway, getting to that's why we're talking football with a high-powered oil and gas attorney here, because he also does a podcast and a radio program and writes a column for Bison Illustrated. So the Bison Illustrated podcast, magazine, radio show. Heard it, Bison, it's called?
Heard it here with Swanee on 740 AM. And you know what? The real interesting thing, Jason, you'll appreciate this. When I'm in Oklahoma or Texas or wherever, and there's a legal proceeding involved or a meeting involving an oil and gas company, one of the things where we always find common ground, especially in Oklahoma and Texas, is talking college football, because there's so many passionate Big 12 fans and even SEC fans between OU, Oklahoma State, UT in Austin, Texas Tech, Texas A&M, they're an SEC school, but a lot of great college football fans in Oklahoma and Texas. And outside of our day jobs, it's fun, visiting with these oil and gas guys, because they're all about college football, and they know about North Dakota State. So
let's venture, and we got to wrap up here very quickly, but I wanted to ask you about Wyoming. I know it's outside of your zone, but Coach Craig Bull is there, so I don't know if you keep tabs on that program. We've got affiliates in Wyoming. So the other reason is Marcus Epps. He's the only one who was drafted by the NFL out of the University of Wyoming. I saw they have a few people signed as well, but he was drafted by the Vikings. So I don't know. I mean, we're close to the Vikings. You live 3 hours away. I don't know if you're a Vikings fan, but just by where you live, you have to follow them. And so, if you're going to follow sports, you just, you can't not follow the local team. And then with Coach Bull being in Wyoming, Coach Craig Bull, do you know anything about this Marcus Epps or any of those Wyoming players or any players in the region outside of NDSU?
Well, what I can tell you about Epps is he's a guy North Dakota State fans would recognize if he were plugged into a North Dakota State into the program here, just because, Coach Bull, how he set up the program. And I knew Coach Bull, when he was one of the candidates for the job. I was a student at North Dakota State and actually gave him a tour of campus, and after he was hired, I brought him around all the student organizations so he could visit with them. And he's another guy who's always been, good to me and good to my brother. And what he's doing in Wyoming, he's a great coach. He's building a good program. Needs some time. He's taken him to a couple bowl games, and obviously everyone listening in Wyoming will know about Josh Allen, Wyoming stud quarterback, who had a rookie season with the Buffalo Bills where he really started to emerge as a solid NFL quarterback. So if Craig's given enough time out there, he's gonna. And they made a Mountain West championship game, I think, only 2 years ago. So he'll get those guys to the spot where they're perennially competing for a Mountain West title, given enough time in Wyoming. And he's another guy, built the North Dakota State program, won 3 national championships here, and the fact that Wyoming is cranking out kids that are playing in the NFL and being drafted definitely doesn't surprise me, knowing Coach Bull and his staff.
Yeah, I know. I think Coach Bull probably should deserve a little more credit, and he probably gets it, I guess, for that program that was built at NDSU, because quite honestly, a lot of the coaches are just tweaking what Coach Bull has already built. Is that a fair thing to say?
And I think that's absolutely fair. And, Coach Kleiman in his own right, took the program to a different level and established his own footprint. But all of that doesn't happen with Craig. And I think some Bison fans have a bad taste in their mouth with how the breakup went down where he left to Wyoming. And I think in enough time, those wounds will heal. But, yeah, what Coach Bull did to the program, he was one of what I call the big three between him and Joe Chapman and Gene Taylor, the 3 guys that took NDSU through the Division I transition and then built that football program into what it is today, a team that's regularly appearing on ESPN, on college game days, on Sports Center,
right,
turning out NFL quality players. Coach Kleiman and now Coach Entz, they've done things in their own right that deserve a lot of credit. But I think what Craig Bull, what he did here gets undervalued sometimes by a good portion of the fan base that just still has some bruised feelings with how that breakup went down in 2013.
That's unfortunate, because I've never looked at it that way. I've always looked at it like, he built the foundation that currently exists. And, with the Gene Taylor and Chapman, those are great ways to put it as far as the 3 of them, because it was a 3-headed deal that built that, but Bull was one of it. And, the breakup, I get it, but he also had to go, wasn't that Josh Allen he was going to get? I mean, wasn't that the guy, it was a quarterback was the reason he had to react, because the guy was going to go to a different school, and so he basically had to make a black and white decision. Hand it off now, go save my future, or struggle in the future right away. You know what I mean? I thought there was something like with a recruit that he had to go to right away, and so he had to make a really tough decision, but he made it. And he, go on. Sorry.
The fans listening or folks in Texas and Oklahoma will understand and appreciate, whether it's Coach Riley coming in for Bob Stoops at Oklahoma or down in Texas where Todd Herman came in from the University of Houston. Those recruits, the lifeblood of any program is recruiting the people you're bringing in. Just like any business, you need good people, and there's such a high turnover in college football. You got guys coming in every single year, and you're having a different roster one year to the next. So you can't waste any time going after recruits and bringing in good people to your program. So there was certainly a component of that as part of the decision-making process where you can't wait around. And we saw the same thing this year with Chris Kleiman at North Dakota State, how he took the Kansas State job in the middle of NDSU's playoff run, and just like Coach Bull coached out the remainder of the year through the national championship game where the Bison won both times. But yeah, that's absolutely right. College football today, you need to hit the ground running as a new head coach in what they're calling this year 0 and locking up recruits to start building a program, because if you don't, after 2 or 3 years, the patience to build a winner, it's not like years ago where teams had 4 or 5 years, and even, if you look back to the 60s and 70s, John Wooden for UCLA basketball went like 13 years without winning a national championship. That would never happen today because the time frames are so truncated. So I think that's one of the aspects where a lot of Bison fans don't necessarily understand that there's some, probably competing interests might be the fair way to put it. But, I know for me personally, wish Craig and his staff nothing but the best, and hope that they do well in Wyoming and build them into that conference championship contending program.
Oh, I'm a huge fan of Coach Bull, and Well, his wife and I worked together for a long time. She officed next to me for probably 3 years. So, I mean, I got to know her from a professional and then personal standpoint too, just because we were colleagues in the business and the industry for a long time. So yeah, I wish them nothing but success. And like I said, I've never thought anything that ill, but I could see where diehards, I mean, people burn LeBron James jerseys. So, fans are passionate too, man. So, hey, Big Eddie knew how to relate to the fans, and we're tying it all back together here. So we better wrap up here, but hey, give your legal stuff a plug here, because we know you got some cases going on, Wilkinson versus North Dakota, and that's, currently, I guess, open in court. And so, there's not much probably to comment on but give yourself a little plug on how people can get in touch with you if they want to talk a little football and maybe get some legal advice too.
We have a website, vogellaw.com. Folks can check that out. They can give us a call at 701-237-6983. That's 701-237-6983. My email is jswanson@vogellaw.com. And one of the areas, and you talk about the lake minerals, and that obviously gets a lot of attention, but I think a great thing for everybody, both operator perspective and landowner, mineral owner side, is there's a lot of development going on with pipeline infrastructure and saltwater disposal wells and different well pads for drilling new oil and gas wells. And we do a lot of work negotiating those agreements on behalf of landowners with operators. We have really good relationships with the operators and deal with them all the time. And now, especially the pore space issue is something we're getting a lot of calls about, where the industry and landowners both have interest in that. And what we're telling our clients and what industry has been amenable to doing is negotiating agreements that address that and do respect and provide for the surface owner rights and compensation. So if you got listeners out there that are dealing with that, saltwater disposal or natural gas and different pore space issues, they can certainly give us a call and ask for me at 701-237-6983, and I'd be more than happy to visit with them about that.